everybody. My name is Samuel Tomatz, and today I'm joined by
Phil Capshaw.
Welcome to Perspectives.
Yeah, we were discussing this earlier, and there's about a 22-year spread between the two of us. And my movie knowledge dates back to about 1970 to 2000, and your perspective is?
I've seen a lot of those movies from the 70s to the 2000s, a lot of stuff in film school. I mean, in film school, we went back to the very dawn of filmmaking, but a lot of my knowledge it comes around recent movies, last 20 years, the 2000s to 2025.
Okay.
I don't watch many movies these days. I find myself really busy making movies, but I still try to get out to the theaters and see as much as I can.
Yeah.
I think speaking of new and interesting that's come out, both me and you were talking previously about Adolescence on Netflix.
Adolescence. Oh, yeah. So, what intrigues you about that?
I think for me, I always think of so much of the technical side of stuff that happens, and watching a show like that is done truly in one take, it feels to me like a play, and you're just watching these performances of these actors as they do this thing, and you're seeing this story only in one way. There's one thing to look at, and they've really crafted this visual piece of you're looking here, and you're looking here, and you're looking here, and this is how we are describing the story. It's just so powerful, I think, to see exactly that. It's such a complicated piece of a technical marvel, and you're watching it. I think it's also interesting thinking about how making films, and sometimes you'll do 20, 30, 40 takes on something to get, one or two lines, and to see that they only had, forget if it was like between 10 and 12 takes to get this one performance, and you have to get it all in a way, and I feel like it's such a vulnerable experience. There's not going to be finding the best line here, and now I'm going to go back 5 takes to get this line, and now I'm going to go forward 6 takes and get this line.
Yeah.
You have to pick one take that you like the entirety of it.
And a lot of times from what I've read, I mean, of course I've never been behind the camera as a director, but a lot of that has to do with the director. Mm-hmm. And some of these directors, from what I've seen, are perfectionists, and they'll do 100 takes, and they'll till they finally get one that they like, which as an actor, if I were an actor, that would really be irritating, to sit there and do 100 takes of the same scene over and over and over again until he gets that just one little nuance that the director wants to capture, but it's an art.
It is, and I think it's it's interesting to see as people get different parts in their career, how different people handle it, and approach these different subjects of directing, and how to get these performances out of their talent and friends and actors, and it's such an art form.
Yeah.
Interesting to see. But I think I really liked Adolescence because I love theater, and I love the vulnerability in theater, and just kind of letting the actors really have their moment. And I feel like that really returned it, and I'd like to see a show like that again, where you're really seeing that vulnerability of it. And I think it's really interesting because we've seen supposedly the one-take films before, but there have always been these, stitched pieces, and they're gorgeous works. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's interesting to see that they saw that and they still chose to do stuff where like they're specifically directing the eye of a viewer, but now that they're also letting these actors really push with their performances to get this story told.
Well, and there's something to be said for live performance, but to capture it on film, to capture a live performance on film, I don't think it's really been done in such a way that you're like, it comes out like a Star Wars.
Yeah.
Rehearsals and all that kind of stuff. I've seen a lot of plays on the West End and off-Broadway plays, but and they don't compare. It's a different feel than a movie.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Live performance is a different feel than a movie, but yeah, to do it in 1 or 2 takes, I think would really be difficult to really capture what you're trying to convey to an audience, as far as the art form itself. But, that's interesting.
I'm interested to see if it shifts anything in Hollywood, if people start picking up on that, that starts being something more we'll see, because I think there's been a lot of success around the show, or if it's a really cool thing that people are like, that was a great show, and then we just kind of go back to our.
Oh, you can bet that Hollywood will jump on the bandwagon. I mean, they always do. You know, how many different shows have you seen that were successful that all of a sudden are being copied? You know.
Oh, so many.
Yeah, you know, I can't off the top of my head I can't think of any, but I know that you know they go through cycles. Indiana Jones, you know, there were a couple TV series that were very similar to Indiana Jones, and there was actually a movie. You know, Tom Selleck was originally the first choice to play Indiana Jones.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. But the thing is, he wasn't available at the time because he was making Magnum PI, and he couldn't get out of his contract.
Okay.
And then they released him from his contract, and they were already making a movie, and they'd already picked Harrison Ford. You know.
Wow.
And the reason that Spielberg didn't want Harrison Ford, he wanted Tom Selleck, and it's because he'd already worked with Harrison Ford on Star Wars. You know.
Yeah.
And you know how different history would be if we'd have had Tom Selleck as Indiana Jones.
I feel like it would have just become such a different film, such a different franchise.
Yeah. Now he did make a film. I can't remember the name of it. I'm sure somebody out there knows the name of the film. But Tom Selleck did make a film very similar to Indiana Jones, where he was in the fedora and the leather vest, and but I can't off the top of my head. I can't remember the name of it. And oddly, if you look at the Chipmunks. Chip and Dale. Did you ever watch Chip and Dale when you were a kid?
I did. Yeah, I've seen a little bit of it.
Okay. You remember one of them's wearing a vest and a fedora?
Yeah.
And the other one's wearing a what?
I don't know.
A Hawaiian shirt.
Huh, so they were modeled off of him?
One was Indiana Jones, the other one was Magnum PI.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, if you stop and go back and look at them, and you'll see. I mean, you know, why didn't we catch that when we were, you know, growing up? Of course, that was before you were born, I think.
Maybe.
Because that was in the 90s, in the 90s or the late 80s, when Chip and Dale and the Rescue Rangers was on.
Yeah, probably. I mean, because you say Chipmunks, and I automatically think of Alvin and the Chipmunks.
No, I'm thinking of Chip and Dale. Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, so they were modeled after Indiana Jones and Magnum PI.
Okay.
Yeah, at least their clothing was. The characters weren't, but the clothing was.
Yeah, it's something I have to look into.
Yeah, a lot of weird, like I said, Hollywood repeats itself.
Yeah.
Over and over again. So,
I mean, we've just been seeing same stories for thousands of years.
Yeah, basically. Well, they'll pull out, you know, like Dune. You know, they pulled out Dune. And then Schwarzenegger had a pretty good franchise there for a while with Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, okay.
You know, and that was originally a book series. You know, but they it seems like they've tried to pull some of this stuff out of some really old material, and some have taken, some have not. You know.
Interesting. I'd be interested to see where it keeps going, kind of over time.
Yeah. Well, it's a matter of money, I guess.
I know. We'll only learn in time.
Yeah, that's true. What's your favorite genre?
Favorite genres, that's always been, I think, a really tricky one for me. I always have a hard time saying a favorite this, favorite that. I think for a long time it was sci-fi. And I think kind of more recently it's been going more towards horror.
Really? Yeah. I never got into horror, although growing up I did see a lot of the things that are franchises today. You know, Friday the 13th, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre,
Okay.
you know, stuff like that. I did see those growing up, which today I'm like, wish I hadn't, because they're pretty scary, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like as a kid, I love things Star Wars, Star Trek, all of those huge franchises, and I just couldn't get enough of it, and I wanted to keep going. And then as I kind of got older and started watching different films, it kind of became this thing of loving kind of this horror and this mystery. And I love psychological horror and psychological thrillers and that type of stuff. And one show that's always been one of my favorites has been Black Mirror. And it just gets so under your skin, but it's kind of creepy without kind of the jump scare nature of some of the kind of more, franchise horror pieces. But it's still, like, there's episodes that still scare me today. And they're just, seen them 6 years ago, and they're still under your skin.
Yeah, that's Black Mirror's recent. Growing up, I watched a lot. I've seen every episode of Twilight Zone.
Okay.
That was my favorite. My personal favorite was Twilight Zone. But during that time period in the 60s, it was so popular that, again, Hollywood just kind of recreated it over and over again. So you had Twilight Zone, you had Outer Limits, you had The Next Step Beyond. There were several series that were similar. And then going into the 70s, Night Gallery. Have you ever seen Night Gallery?
I have not.
Okay, you need to, some weekend, you need to watch Night Gallery, because it'll scare you.
Okay.
It's kind of like Black Mirror. Talking about horror or things that scare you in the night, Twilight Zone was the first for me.
Okay.
That really scared me. Have you ever seen any episodes of Twilight Zone?
I have not.
The original? Really?
No.
That's another one you need to watch it, because the thing I liked about Twilight Zone, and the thing that's changed, is in the 60s they had very strict regulations on what they could put on television. So they couldn't show what they're showing on Black Mirror. Of course, Black Mirror is streaming, so they get by with more than what they would get by with on television. But even by today's standards, Twilight Zone was kind of, they had to psychologically scare you, and they did it. Rod Serling was a phenomenal writer, phenomenal talent, and he was the narrator.
Okay.
For every episode, he would narrate the episode, and not all of them were scary. Some of them were funny. Kind of like Black Mirror. They're not all scary. Some of them are actually funny. The parody of Star Trek was kind of funny, kind of scary, and that's kind of what Twilight Zone is. And it was so popular that they've remade it. They remade it in the 80s. I think they remade it in the 90s, and then more recently, the guy from Key and Peele. You know Key and Peele?
I don't.
The comedians. They had a show, Key and Peele.
Oh, I've heard the name, but I don't know their name.
Yeah. Well, anyway, he did a recent version of it too. It just didn't quite take off, and he narrated it. And but nothing stands up to the original. Now, in the 80s, if you look at some of the writing that was done in the 80s for the Twilight Zone series, one of them was written, or one of the guys on the writing team, and forgive me, George R.R. Martin, if I don't give you enough credit, but I know he had a lot of impact on it. And of course, he wrote Game of Thrones.
Right.
But he was on the writing team for the 80s revival of the Twilight Zone. And then of course there was the movie, The Twilight. Did you ever see the movie, The Twilight Zone?
I have not. I've been told so often that I need to see some of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, the movie, you need to watch the movie too, because it was fairly well done.
Okay.
I want to say, and we're going by memory here, because I don't have any notes on it, but I want to say Burgess Meredith did the narration.
Okay.
Which was pretty good. And I forget the actor's name who did the narration for the TV series, but he was equally as good. But the thing I liked about the original series is you would get scared by what you didn't see,
right? Not
by what you actually saw. And they would do it with lighting, and I mean they were so creative back in those days, that they didn't have the special effects that we have today, so they had to create ways to do some of this stuff. And then the Outer Limits, that was kind of a creature of the week. They had a makeup team that was really phenomenal on that show that would do a creature of the week, So they always had something different. Every week they had something different that would scare you.
Right.
They are. So what scared you the most about Black Mirror?
I think the psychological stuff, I mean, we talked a lot about the one episode of the Star Trek stuff, but just the getting trapped in your consciousness without ever being free. Like the film just ends with you just being there, only with your thoughts. There's nothing else. You're just in a black void. You can't do anything.
Right, you're just trapped.
You're just trapped. Nothing to interact with. And I think that just freaked me out about just like, oh, you're trapped.
I want to say that it was the remake of The Outer Limits, and I could be wrong. Somebody can fact check me on it. But there was an episode. It was either the revival of The Outer Limits or the revival of The Twilight Zone, and it takes place in the not too distant future. And everybody has an implant, and the implant allows them to access the internet through their mind.
Okay.
So they have instant access to all the knowledge in the world at the time. So this is like not too distant future. Well, what happens is there's this one guy, and he's a janitor at the library, and he had if you had some kind of brain trauma, you could not get the implant.
Okay.
So there's a hierarchy here, a discriminatory hierarchy.
Yeah.
And they kind of look down on those people who don't have the implant.
Okay.
And these people that do. Well, something happens, and a virus happens, and it downloads into the internet, and it turns off everybody's implants.
Oh, interesting.
So nobody knows what to do. They don't know how to do anything because they rely on instant information to show them how to do stuff. And the only person that knows how to do anything is the guy at the library who read all the books.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's the psychological thriller side of either Outer Limits or Twilight Zone. I can't remember which one it was, but yeah, it's worth watching some of the old stuff.
Yeah, worth seeing it and having it get under your skin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's it's the fear of the unknown.
Right.
That really scares you the most.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's like, the modern stuff, you see these creatures, but at the end of the day, it's like, that's not as scaring you as much as what your own imagination can create.
Yeah.
You see these things, you see the horrific parts of what it might do, what the monster might do to people, and then you're able to fill in all this stuff and imagine everything, that it's like more powerful to think of what that might actually be.
Have you ever been to a haunted house?
I have.
Yeah. I remember when I was a kid, probably 9, maybe 10 years old, I went to a haunted house. They had this old dilapidated house in town, and somebody like the Shriners or somebody would make a haunted house, and you'd walk through the haunted house, and there'd be somebody be standing there with it was a bowl of grapes, and it's supposed to be eyeballs, and then they'd have spaghetti and pasta sauce, and in the dark it kind of looked like blood and guts and all this stuff, and I'll never forget the experience of going through this haunted house. And you go through each of these things, and then there's always the guy with the chainsaw, chasing you, and so you get scared of that. The thing that scared me the most was on the way out. You turn this corner, and there's this hallway, and all of a sudden the lights go out.
Oh.
Right? So it's completely dark, and you know that on the other end of this hallway there's a door to get out. Well, thing that happened to me, here I am 9, I was 8, 9 years old, maybe 10, and I'm walking down this hallway and the lights go out, and something grabbed me.
Oh.
And grabbed me by, kind of on the shoulder or something, and I screamed, and I broke out and started heading for that door, and turned around and looked, and it was this guy, a dad, who thought I was his son, and he was trying to help me get out, and his son was behind him, actually. I was in front of him, and he grabbed me, and that scared me more than anything, It was like, because you're in the dark, and then all of a sudden somebody grabs you and you're like,
It gives me shivers just thinking about
yeah,
it.
I know
Freaking me
it
out.
was kind of freaky, but that's, and again, it's the fear of the unknown, because I didn't know who this guy was. I had no
Yeah.
idea, but he was just a dad trying to help who he thought was his son get out of the.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like my time that I went to a haunted house that stays in my memory was when I was probably 15 or 16, and went with some friends for Halloween to it, and we got stuck in the very back of the car. So like all the scares would happen, and then we'd hear their reactions, and then we'd round the corner, and the guy's there with the chainsaw, and you're like already heard the screams, so it's already spoiled for you. So you're just kind of walking through, and you're like, oh, there's a dude in a mask.
Yeah.
Nothing was like as freaky for us. So I think it's like if you know what it is, you're not scared as much as if you can kind of just like fill it in with your imagination or do that stuff.
Yeah, and I guess that's the difference between reading a book where your imagination fills in and watching a movie where some other person has put their stamp on it and made it, And there are a few films that really capture that, Stanley Kubrick did a lot of movies that were terrifying, like The Shining, for instance. I mean, that was pretty scary, and Stephen King's movies and novels. I got into a kick of watching those when I was probably your age.
Okay.
And saw quite a few of the Stephen Kings. Carrie and oh gosh, I can't remember all of them. I mean, he's written so many, but his stuff was pretty frightening too.
Yeah.
Just the way it's written and it's that fear of the unknown, what's going to happen next, and what you don't see is more scary than what you do see.
Yeah, I know. I think I saw Jaws for the first time when I was like 4 or 5. I remember being so terrified of it, not finishing the film and just being so afraid of the shark and what was about to happen and where the character is going to live or where they're going to die. And it was like you watch it, I watched it when I was probably 10 or so, and then I was like, oh, that's not that scary at all. And by that point, it looked pretty fake, and it's this rubber animatronic coming out.
Yeah.
But it was like as a kid, just not knowing and just being so afraid to watch the film. Thought it was one of the most horrifying films I'd ever seen.
Where did you see Jaws?
Saw it at home.
Oh.
Yeah, the living room was
I
dark.
saw it in the movie theater.
Oh wow, okay.
That was the first movie that I remember ever having to wait in line for.
Oh wow, okay.
It was so popular at the time. There was a line to get into it, and it was just out the door, try to get in to see this movie. And I wish I hadn't seen it because it was terrifying. It scared me to death. And I'll never forget, I grew up in Oklahoma, and we would, occasionally we'd go out to the lake and we'd go skiing, water skiing. And I remember being in the lake, and I'm in the lake and I'm floating, and I'm waiting for the boat to, you grab when you water ski, you grab hold of the rope and they pull you up and you water ski. Well, I'm in the lake and I'm floating there and I hear that music, doo 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 doo, and I'm like, I got to get out of here,
Yeah.
So I got out of the water and I couldn't do it. I couldn't ski.
Wow.
It scared me that much. That was one of those movies that that was. And did you know that was loosely based on a true story?
Really?
Yeah. On the East Coast, I want to say along the Massachusetts there, back in the 1930s or 40s, a shark. They don't do well in fresh water. Okay. And a shark had gotten into a freshwater stream. Okay. And went upstream, and these kids were at a fishing hole and actually one of them got eaten by that shark. Wow. Normally they don't attack like that, but it was because it was in fresh water. It kind of messed with its mind, and,
right.
And stuff like that. But there were like several reports of shark attacks back in those days, and so it was based, like I say, loosely based on something that actually happened.
Huh. I feel like that's so much more horrifying knowing that it was kind of somewhat based on something that really happened. Yeah. It's not just my imagination.
Yeah, I know. Of course, you're going to need a bigger boat.
Yeah.
That's a huge shark.
Yeah. I don't know, those types of films that you're not seeing. You might see the monster at the very end, or you
Yeah.
might not see it at all. It's just so horrifying to think about what's coming of it.